Um, like, what is that? That is so gross. Just die already.
What? What? No, I just had a allergic reaction to the goat milk. It's nothing. While exploring the biblical narratives in my search for truth, I can't help but think about the story of Job in the Bible. It's probably one of the most challenging and controversial narratives when I examine the character of God and the theological implications of divine justice, suffering, and morality. How could God allow Satan to tempt and afflict Job, resulting in immense suffering, loss of family, possessions, and health over a bet? The book of Job, found in the Old Testament, is a poetic and theological exploration of suffering, faith, and divine sovereignty. The story begins with Job's righteousness and prosperity, followed by a cosmic wager, a bet between God and Satan, that leads to Job's suffering. Job 1 through 5. Job is introduced as a man from Uz, described as blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. He is wealthy with 10 children, vast livestock, and a large household. Job regularly offers sacrifices on behalf of his children, concerned they might have sinned, showing his piety and devotion. Job 1 through 12. The scene shifts to a heavenly council where Satan, a term meaning the adversary or accuser in Hebrew, who is often seen and interpreted as a prosecuting attorney-like figure, rather than the later Christian devil, appears before God. God praises Job, saying, "There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil." Job 1:8. Satan challenges God, arguing that Job's loyalty is due to his prosperity. Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not put a hedge around him and his household and everything he has? Job 1:9 through 10. Satan proposes that if Job's blessings are removed, he will curse God. God grants Satan permission to test Job, saying, "Very well then, everything he has is in your power, but there's a stipulation. On the man himself, do not lay a finger, yet Job was inflicted with boils." Satan leaves to afflict Job. Job 1:13 through 19. Calamities strike in rapid succession. Sabeans steal Job's oxen and donkeys and kill his servants. Fire from the sky, possibly lightning, consumes his sheep and more servants. Does Satan have power over the air? I guess he does with lightning, right? He's consuming Job's sheep and more servants. The Chaldeans raid his camels and kill more servants, and a mighty wind collapses a house, killing all of Job's children. Job, unaware of the heavenly wager, mourns but responds, "The Lord gave and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised." Job 1 through 21. How would you react in this instance? Would you be praying out to God? Would you be cursing God? "Thanks, God. May God be praised." Job 2 1 through 10. In another heavenly council, God again praises Job's steadfastness, Job 2:3. Satan argues that Job's loyalty persists because his physical health remains intact. Skin for skin. A man will give all he has for his own life. But now stretch out your hand and strike his flesh and bones, and he will surely curse you to his face. So God permits Satan to afflict Job's body, saying, "Very well then, he is in your hands, but you must spare his life." Job 2:6. So this Temptation is ongoing. He passed that. Get in a little deeper. Let's get in a little deeper. You can do anything you want, but don't kill him. So Satan inflicts Job with painful sores from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. Job 2:7. Often interpreted as boils or a similar debilitating condition. Job's wife urges him to curse God and die, but Job replies, "Shall we accept good from God and not trouble?" Job 2:9-10. Job 42:10-17. After lengthy dialogues where Job's questioning God's justice and God responds from a whirlwind asserting divine sovereignty without directly explaining Job's suffering, God restores Job's fortunes. Job receives double his previous wealth, woohoo! Has 10 children now, and lives a long life. The text does not indicate that Job is ever informed of the heavenly wager or bet, these shenanigans that God and Satan are conducting up in the heavenly realm over Job, a righteous man. This narrative raises profound ethical and theological questions about God's character, especially when viewed through a modern lens or from Job's perspective. God's actions in allowing Satan to afflict Job portray God as a diabolical, narcissistic, and psychologically problematic God. And again, that contradicts the biblical premise of a loving God. The premise of the story hinges on the bet, the wager between God and Satan, initiated by God's boasting about Job's righteousness in Job 1-8. This suggests that God is not entirely confident in Job's loyalty as he entertains Satan's challenge rather than dismissing it outright. By granting Satan permission to destroy Job's possessions, family, and health in Job 1:12 and 2-6, God prioritizes proving a point to Satan over protecting a faithful servant. And this raises several issues. If God is omniscient, he already knows Job's heart and loyalty. Why allow the test at all? The wager serves no purpose for Job's spiritual growth, as he is already blameless and upright. It appears to be a cosmic game between Satan and God, with Job as an unwitting pawn, participant, suggesting God values his reputation or ego over human lives. The deaths of Job's children, servants, and livestock are treated as acceptable losses in this divine experiment. The children in particular are innocent and uninvolved in the wager, yet God permits their slaughter. This callousness undermines the claims of God's justice and love. As the children are not restored, the new children in Job 42 are not the same individuals. This is a narcissistic motivation. God's decision to boast about Job and engage in the bet and the wager suggests a need for validation. A narcissistic deity might prioritize proving Satan wrong over the well-being of his creation, treating humans as a means to an end rather than an end in themselves. Job's afflictions, his loss of wealth, the death of his children, and physical torment are extreme, especially given his righteousness. The boils in Job 2:7 cause excruciating pain, social isolation as he sits in ashes in Job 2:8, and psychological anguish. From Job's perspective, unaware of the heavenly bet, this suffering is inexplicable and unjust. Job's suffering contradicts biblical passages like Deuteronomy 28, which promise blessings for obedience and curses for disobedience. Job, being blameless, should expect divine protection, not affliction. God's allowance of the suffering appears arbitrary and cruel, and it undermines the idea of a just God. By withholding the reason for his suffering, God leaves Job in existential despair, questioning his faith and meaning of his life. Job 3, 7 through 10. This silence suggests a lack of empathy, as God could have reassured Job or spared him the psychological torment of believing he was abandoned. Allowing Satan, the adversary, to act as an agent of divine will blurs the line between good and evil. If God permits Satan to inflict harm, it raises questions about God's moral consistency and whether he is complicit in evil actions. In Job 42, God restores Job's fortunes, giving him double his wealth and new children. Yippee! While this is framed as a happy ending, it reinforces the perception of God as diabolical and people's lives do not matter. The new children do not replace the ones lost. From a human perspective, children are unique individuals, not commodities to be swapped out. God's apparent view that new children can make up for the dead ones trivializes human life and parental grief. The restoration implies that suffering can be offset by material rewards, reducing Job's experience to a transaction. This undermines the depths of his loss and suggests that God believes wealth and new family members can ease trauma. Oh, you'll just get a new family. It doesn't matter about the old family. You get a new wife and new kids. Can you imagine finding out that God allowed this to happen to you and your loved children, your devoted wife, were killed, and then as a result of that, God gives you new children and a new wife? Just move on. You got new kids. You got a new wife. What are you complaining about? You don't have to worry. You're ungrateful. I gave you more than what you had. I mean, yeah, okay. He was in a bet with Satan and allowed Satan to basically do anything he wanted to. Satan inflicted Job with boils, had his family slaughtered, wife and kids, and Job should be happy because he actually got more as a result of that. Well, you did suffer, but hey, you got more wealth and you got probably a prettier wife, maybe a younger one, and you got even more children. So quit crying about it. Quit whining. You should be happy. Okay. God never reveals the wager to Job, leaving him to assume his suffering was divine punishment or caprice. The lack of transparency further portrays God as a manipulative, withholding information type of God to maintain control. The story of Job clashes with other biblical depictions of God as loving, merciful, and protective. Psalm 23, 1 through 4. The Lord is my shepherd. He protects me from evil. A shepherd who allows a wolf, Satan, to attack his flock contradicts his image. Matthew 7, 9 through 11. Jesus compares God to a loving father who gives good gifts to his children, not stones or snakes. Allowing Satan to destroy Job's life resembles giving a snake to a faithful child. 1 John 4, 8. God is love. I don't think a loving God would subject a righteous person to suffer for a bet, especially without informing them later or before of their purpose. Psalm 91, 11 through 12. God promises to command angels to protect his faithful. Job receives no protection. In fact, God invites it. And this suggests a contradiction in the Bible or in God's character. What should I lean on? More of a contradiction in the Bible or a contradiction in God's character? So these contradictions fuel the argument that the Job narrative reflects a human authorized text, grappling with the problem of evil rather than a consistent divine revelation. The portrayal of God as engaging in a wager with Satan aligns more with ancient Near Eastern views of deities as competitive, rather than the omnibenevolent God of later biblical theology. Imagine being Job, a devout, righteous person who prays, sacrifices, and lives uprightly. You believe God is just and protective. He's got your back. Suddenly, your wealth is stolen. Your servants and your livestock are killed, and your children die in a catastrophic accident. Then your body is ravaged by painful sores, leaving you in agony and isolation. Your wife, overwhelmed by grief, urges you to abandon faith. You have no idea why this is happening. You cry out to God, Job 7:20, 10:2 through 7, but receive silence. Or later, a divine speech asserting God's power without addressing your suffering, like in Job 38:41. The loss of children is among the deepest human griefs. Job's pain is compounded by the lack of explanation, leading to feelings of betrayal and abandonment by the God he served faithfully. The boils add physical torment on top of it, making every moment agonizing. Job questions the meaning of his life and his faith in Job 3:1 through 26. If righteousness leads to such suffering, what is the point of devotion? This mirrors the despair anyone might feel if their trust in a higher power is met with inexplicable cruelty. Learning hypothetically that your suffering was due to a divine wager would likely provoke anger and a sense of betrayal. It would feel as though God valued his own glory and his bet over your family's lives, treating you as a means to prove a point. From Job's shoes, God's actions would feel monstrous, arbitrary, callous, and narcissistic. A God who allows such suffering to test loyalty without regard for the human cost seems more like a tyrant than a loving father. So the book of Job is often dated to the 6th or 4th century BCE, and it reflects ancient Near Eastern wisdom literature. Its portrayal of God may stem from human attempts to grapple with the problem of evil rather than divine inspiration. The story resembles other ancient narratives. They had stories like the Babylonians, where a righteous sufferer questions divine justice. The heavenly council and Satan's role echo the Mesopotamian and Canaanite myths where gods debate or test humans. And that suggests the story of Job is a product of his culture, not something that actually occurred between God and Satan. The contradictory portrayal of God as loving versus wager making may reflect different authors or theological traditions within the Bible. The Job narrative prioritizes divine sovereignty over human welfare, aligning with older, more authoritarian views of deity. A God who engages in bets, boasts about his followers, and then allows suffering to prove a point mirrors human flaws like pride, competitiveness, and indifference. This suggests that the story projects human psychological traits onto God rather than depicting a transcendent perfect being. Some argue Job's story shows the faith that he should endure and we should endure, the trials and God's restoration. It demonstrates God's ultimate goodness. No, this ignores the ethical problem of causing the suffering for a test, especially when the test is unnecessary given God's omniscience and involves innocent lives. This restoration does not undo the trauma or justify the means. Well, God's ways are mysterious. The divine speeches in Job 38:41 emphasize God's incomprehensible wisdom. But this dodges accountability. If God's actions appear unjust to human reason, and humans are made in God's image, the disconnect again suggests that either divine indifference or a flawed human depiction of God is at work here. Well, it's not God that causes the suffering. God only permits Satan's actions, not directly causing them. No, by granting permission and setting the terms, God is complicit. An all-powerful God could have stopped Satan or protected Job and his family, but chose not to. He prioritizes the wager, the bet, over humans' lives. Imagine you are a devout believer, living righteously, praying daily and caring for your family. Without warning, your children are slaughtered. Your home and your wealth are destroyed, and you're struck with painful diseases. You cry out to God, but get no answers. Later, you're given new wealth and children, as if that eases the loss of your loved ones. If you learned this was all because God made a bet with Satan, how would you feel? Betrayal. You'd feel used, as if your faith and suffering were props in a divine game. What about anger? The deaths of your children for a test would seem unforgivable, especially from a God you loved and trusted. What about despair? The lack of explanation during your suffering would make you question God's love and justice. Alienation. A new family and wealth might feel hollow as they cannot replace what was lost or heal the trauma. So, this exercise highlights the human cost of God's actions in Job, making the narrative feel like a stark contradiction to a God who claims to love and protect his children. The story of Job presents a God who allows immense suffering for a seemingly trivial wager, prioritizing divine pride over human lives. And this portrayal boasts to Satan, permitting the death of innocents and restoring Job with replacements as if human lives are interchangeable, paints God as narcissistic, callous, and morally inconsistent. The contradictions with biblical passages about God's love and protection, like in Psalm 23, 1 John 4:8, suggest that Job reflects human struggles to understand suffering, rooted in ancient culture and literary traditions rather than a coherent divine revelation. From Job's perspective, the experience would be devastating, undermining trust in a God who allows such cruelty for a test. I got your back. I'll protect you. God is love, but he's up there with Satan having bets, even over a righteous person, and replaces children like they're nothing. Again, the Bible talks about God having children slaughtered, murdered, throat slit, bellies cut open for women. It just shows that if the biblical God is real, then he really doesn't care about human life the way you think he does. If little children can be slaughtered and if righteous people can undergo the suffering over a bet, what chance do you have? What chance do you have? Are you righteous? Are you as righteous as Job? Job was inflicted with boils and his family was slaughtered. What about protecting his sheep? What about giving life and giving it more abundantly? No, this didn't happen to Job. Job was treated very harshly by a God he loved and trusted. And God boasted about it and boasted afterwards over a bet. See, this is why I don't believe a lot of instances in the Bible, because it really makes God into a monster. And I don't believe that about God. I believe God is loving, God is just, God is fair. God's not going to get up there and have a bet with Satan and allow the enemy to attack you and to steal everything you have and then just give you back like it's not a big deal. Here's a new family, here's new kids, and here's a new wife. La da da. You don't realize what you have. Go on your way now. You should be happy. No. See, this just shows that God, the God of the Bible, is very cold and calculating. It would undermine trust in God who allows cruelty for this bet. So this narrative challenges the notion of a loving, just God, suggesting that it's either a deity with deep-rooted psychological flaws or, more likely, a human-crafted story that reveals the limitations of an ancient theology rather than the nature of a truly demonic, divine being that would allow this calamity to be put upon his children who are righteous. What do you think? Put in the comment section. Do you think God, the God of the Bible, the God who is said to be love, allows innocent blood to be shed, like the children in the Old Testament that are slaughtered, their firstborn? Other instances against Pharaoh, he slaughters, has the firstborn children killed. In other wars, go through and slaughter everybody. Do not leave anybody alive. Slaughter the women and children right down to the animals. What about faith and reconciliation through faith? Allowing people to come to the truth, patience, love. We're supposed to show love and patience, right? love your neighbor like you love yourself. Greater love has no one than to lay down one's life for another one. But yet God is out there slaughtering babies. How does that make you look at people and kids? If God can slaughter babies and we're made in God's image, then if you have thoughts about slaughtering babies, maybe a baby upset you and you want to slaughter that baby, you got to think about, well, what did God do? God had babies slaughtered. Instead of having a God of love, you look back in the Bible and there's no slaughtering of babies. That changes things dramatically. It alters your perception because God would never do something like that. But when you have God doing monstrous things by killing children and waging wars with people and having bets with the enemy, how does that make you feel about God? It angers people and it drives people away. See, stories like this keep atheists from coming to God because they see God as unloving, callous, and just unjust. This turns even Bible believers off. It turns me off. See, that's why I don't believe in a lot of these stories in the Bible. I don't believe God would do something like that. This is mankind. And when people scratch their head, why would God allow that? I just have faith. I just have to have faith. I got to believe it because if I reject the story, then the whole Bible is trash. No, you just have to realize that there are lots of instances in the Bible, especially the storyline, that are not from God. Okay, they're from man. God would never, at least I don't think he would, and I certainly wouldn't want to follow a God that would allow something like that. The God of the Bible is not a God I would want to follow because you can't trust him. You would never do this to your children, would you? Reward them for being obedient and then basically allow bad people to come into your child's lives and give them what happened to Job and allow these bad things to happen to your children? You would protect your children at every cost, wouldn't you? Well, what about God? God could protect his children. We're shown in the Bible that God does protect his children. At least we're told that. But in this case of Job here, we can see that that's not actually true. So either there's a contradiction or we have massive problems with people making things up and inserting things in the Bible. So I think it's more related to a human-crafted story that reveals the limitations of an ancient theology rather than God, the all-powerful, the all-knowing, the all-wise and loving God, giving a righteous man over to the enemy for a bet.
Common sense Christianity.